Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Broom Closet Briefing podcast. And I am your host, Broom. And this is our episode 4. And this week, I want to discuss some of the things that went in the headlines. And if you haven't if you are not up to like date in like catching up with all the articles that I published last week, I will link them at the description of this podcast, and you can go check them out. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the things that went on and the stuff that I already published this week, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it. And thank you for joining me today. And if you are listening to me, get comfortable with get like maybe a cup of tea or whatever beverage you want, and let's get started. So I want to talk about after this detonation of the the e-files, the Epstein files. And I want to also kind of divert your attention a little bit on why power is performing. It's all a performance instead of the governing. So I want to spend this episode doing something slower and more deliberate than usual. If you have been reading the Broom Closet Briefing over the last few weeks, you might have noticed that the pieces I have been publishing, they look on the surface like they are about very different things. Like one is about the Epstein files and what they unleash. One is about Don Lemon's arrest and release, and one is about Elon Musk's trajectory going into 2026. They're all different people, different moments, and different headlines. But I want to tell you very clearly, I did not write these pieces as standalone reactions. I wrote them as part of a single diagnostic exercise, and each article is examining a different layer of response to the same underlying not rapture, rupture. This episode is about making that rupture visible. So, because once you see it, the escalation we are watching stops feeling like random things here and there. It starts feeling more mechanical and kind of like we start connecting the dot. And let's begin where the rupture actually happens. Why do I keep thinking about the word rapture? I don't know. The Epstein files were never just like a decades long, concealed scandal. So I wrote this article called "The Aftermath: What the Epstein File Detonation Sets in Motion." So the article is linked to this episode. You can go read it. But I was very intentional about not framing it as an exposure story. Exposure implies novelty, right? It implies that something shocking has just been discovered. Are any of us shocked about anything that we read in that Epstein file so far? Even the most shocking aspect of it? I was not shocked. That is not what that Epstein files represent. What they represent is confirmation at scale. And for decades, Epstein existed in a liminal space between is it a rumor or is it actually records? Enough information that leaked to make the shape of the thing visible, but never enough to force consequences across the full network. That ambiguity was not accidental, it was functional, right? It allowed the institutions, governments, and individuals to maintain plausible deniability while like still benefiting from the silence. 3 million documents, guys. 3 million documents that end that arrangement. And that is also not the end of it, right? We know they are holding back many more of that. So, what changes here is not just that names that appear in the file, but that patterns that become legible. Travel, money, access, timing, repetition, cross border continuity. When documents reach that volume, the question stops being like, did this actually happen? And becomes more like, how was this allowed to function for so long? I think we all have that question. And that question is radioactive because it immediately implicates structures and not just people. So foreign governments do not read the Epstein files the way American media does. They are not looking for a villain to exile from a polite society. They are looking for leverage, chains, compromises, quiet understandings, points of influence that shaped policy, intelligence, sharing, and financial flows. So, this is where the real destabilization is going to begin or has already begun. Once that kind of material enters the open record, it cannot be managed through a narrative alone. It has to be absorbed, and absorption is slow. It's also messy and deeply, deeply threatening to anyone who relied on the opacity as a shield. So this is a pressure environment. The rest of the articles are written inside. So I would urge you to go check it. And why the regime suddenly looks very sloppy, right? They published the document, they deleted something, they redacted like very messily. They published stuff with the tangerine's name in it, and then all of a sudden deleted. I mean, which is so bizarre because nothing is ever deleted from the internet forever, right? So now here's where people get confused. They see the Epstein files and expect an immediate cascade of resignations, arrests, or clean justice arcs. When that doesn't happen, people would assume the system is not like it's still functioning, right? It's still intact, but that's a mistake. Power would rarely respond to existential threat with transparency. It responds with displacement behavior. So, which is exactly I why I wrote this article the day Don Lemon became a folk hero. It's about the rest of the ex-CNN journalist, and now he is an independent journalist, Don Lemon. When he got arrested, that piece was not primarily about like Don Lemon as an individual. It was about how power behaves when it needs to remind people it still exists. So let's look closely at that arrest because the details kind of matter. So, if the goal had been purely accountability, the mechanics would have reflected that. There would have been formal charges against him, right? There would have been bond, there would have been conditions attached to his release, and there would have been an actual legal trajectory. Instead, what we got was a visual handcuffs on a journalist. Oh my god, a journalists are getting arrested. Police presence, public exposure, but then followed by what? Immediate release. That is not prosecution, that is a symbolic assertion. And symbolic assertion emerges when power is literally under strain elsewhere. This is the key connective insight. Regimes do not suddenly start performing authority unless something has undermined their confidence in quieter forms of control. You would arrest journalists when persuasion, intimidation, and narrative management are no longer sufficient. And when that arrest evaporates as quickly as it appears, it reveals something even more important. The gesture was never meant to hold. It was just meant to be seen. So it was mainly, like I said, it was all about the optics. So that is why I framed the Don Lemon's moment as an initiation rather than a downfall. Because the state reached for restraint and found it had no real grip. That is not strength, but that is more like an exposure. And exposure breeds more performance, not less. So, optics as a stress response. So, let's connect this back to the Epstein. Once elite networks are destabilized by documentation, regimes lose confidence in their ability to manage outcomes discreetly. So that's when they turn to things like spectacle, right? Something like the Don Lemon arrest, raids that don't resolve anything, revived investigations that generate headlines but no closure, and then aggressive gestures meant to signal control rather than achieving any kind of, like concrete results. And this is not governance, this is stress signaling, which brings us to the third article that I wrote, and this is where the individual actors inside the system start to matter. So the article that I dropped in the later half of this week was Elon Musk as a case study in constraint. So when I wrote this article called "The Clown, the Wolves, and the Caravan," I wasn't asking whether Elon Musk is good or bad, or even whether he is guilty of any particular allegation. That binary is, at this point at least, is useless. So what I was examining mostly was capacity under pressure. Musk has long, and even right now as well, he has operated as someone who treats institutions as optional, right? Regulators as nuisances, and then public opinion as something that can be bent through spectacle and volume. So that posture only works when the surrounding system is stable enough to, I would say, absorb disruption. But once the system itself is like destabilized, like right now, once legal, regulatory, and reputational pressures they all converge, the room to maneuver, they start disappearing. So this is why the question of election meddling is so often misunderstood. I get that a lot, and this is that was this is something that I tried to kind of put your attention to about like whether or not he's going to meddle again. People ask whether he will attempt again. The more relevant question is whether he can do so without accelerating his own exposure. Once your name enters the proximity to something like the Epstein archive, even tangentially, you lose that insulation. Every move carries evidentiary weight, and every political alignment would invite scrutiny. And every intervention now risks becoming additive rather than effective. That's what these wolves in that reading represent. Not enemies in the dramatic sense, but consequences that no longer can stay in the background. So, yes, he may posture. Yes, he may say things, but the reading and the broader pattern suggest diminishing returns, influence without some actual control, as well as noise without leverage, and the slow realization that the myth has, I would say, outpaced the machinery, that once sustained it. Now I want to say that one system but has got three responses. Now pull all of these together. The Epstein files is now actively destabilizing elite networks at a structural level. Whether or not the ones fall faster, that is the time thing, but it is destabilizing. The regime is now responding with optics and intimidation theater rather than actual policy. And individual power brokers like Musk, Thiel, they begin operating under constraint rather than expansion. So this is not chaos, this is misalignment. When systems are aligned, power is boring and it doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need spectacle. It doesn't need to prove it can still reach out and touch people. When systems lose alignment, behavior becomes erratic, symbolic, and inefficient. So that is what we are watching right now. Not necessarily collapse all the way, not yet, but the phase that always, I would say, precedes it. The moment when the gestures they stop matching the underlying reality. And that is why these articles they kind of like belong together in telling the same story, right? They are not like specifically predictions in the fortune telling sense. I mean, maybe the Musk article is a little bit, but they are like diagnostics as well. They are ways of reading behavior as data, of understanding that when power starts acting like this, it is reacting to something it cannot fully control. So, if the news feels really surreal right now, it's because you are watching a system that is trying to convince you it still knows what it's doing while quietly recalculating its losses. So, the Epstein files broke a long standing equilibrium, guys. So, everything else the arrests, the raids, the bluster, the billionaire tantrums, theatrics flows from that rupture. So, and once you learn how to see that, you stop being distracted by spectacle alone and start watching the structure. So that's why I keep telling you guys, don't be, distracted by the spectacle. Look into the reasoning why something like this would even happen. If this kind of analysis helps you make sense of what you're seeing, make sure you are following my podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and subscribe to the Broom Closet Briefing Substack. Attention isn't neutral right now, and it's active, and where you place it matters, right? All right, so this was the episode for this week, and I will see you guys next week. I have a very special episode planned about the eclipse on the February 17th, and I'm going to bring some like special information about it. And if you are liking what you are reading on the Broom Closet Briefing Substack or the podcast, make sure you leave me a review on your favorite podcast app where you listen to it. That would help push it out to more people who still do not know that I exist. And I will see you guys in the next episode. Make sure you subscribe to my Substack, free or paid, however you want. And I also offer a Patreon where I teach my method of how I do all of these political readings. And the Patreon is also linked to this episode if you want to check it out on the membership I offer. Go check it out on my Patreon. All right. And I will see you guys in my next episode. Remember, don't be a doomer, be a broomer. Yeah. All right. Have a great rest of the week, guys. Thank you.